This is the story of how an American divorcee triggered a constitutional crisis that permanently altered the course of British history in 1936. Wallis Simpson became the woman at the center of the 20th century's greatest royal scandal in 1936, one that forced a king to make an impossible choice between his crown and the woman he claimed he couldn't live without. What you're about to hear is the complete story of Wallis Simpson, starting with her modest Pennsylvania childhood and ending with her role in one of the most explosive moments the British monarchy has ever faced. We'll look at who she actually was behind the headlines, what really happened during those 11 chaotic months in 1936, and why, nearly 90 years later, this story still gets people arguing. Who was Wallis Simpson? Before we talk about the scandal, you need to understand who Wallis Simpson really was, because the actual woman was far more complicated than the villain history books often paint her as. Born Bessie Wallace Warfield on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, she entered a world that wouldn't make things easy for her. Tuberculosis killed her father when she was only 5 months old, which meant she grew up watching her mother struggle financially. They had social connections through family ties, but almost no money to back them up. Wallis attended Oldfield School in Maryland, where she learned a skill that would define her life: how to move through high society circles with charm instead of wealth. Marriage number 1 came when she was 20 years old in 1916. Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. seemed like a good match at first, a U.S. Navy pilot with prospects, but the marriage turned dark fast. Spencer's alcoholism destroyed whatever happiness they might have had, and after 11 years of what everyone close to them knew was a miserable situation, they divorced in 1927. The second marriage happened in July 1928, when she married Ernest Aldrich Simpson, a British-American shipping executive who gave Wallis something she'd never had before: access to London society. Simpson's business connections and social standing opened doors that would stay locked to a twice-divorced American woman on her own. And through him, she began moving in circles that included some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in Britain. Nobody who met Wallis called her beautiful by the conventional standards of the 1930s. What she had was something harder to define and infinitely more dangerous: style that turned heads, wit that kept people leaning in to hear what she'd say next, and an American directness that felt shocking in a world of British aristocratic reserve. She said what she thought, she dressed like she had money even when she didn't, and she understood how to make herself the most interesting person in any room she walked into. That last part matters more than you think for what came next. Meeting the Prince. November 1930 brought Wallis to a house party in Leicestershire, the kind of weekend gathering where the British upper class mixed business with pleasure, and everyone knew each other's secrets. Someone introduced her to the Prince of Wales that weekend, the man who would eventually become King Edward VIII and the heir to the British throne. The introduction came through Thelma Furness, who happened to be both Wallis's friend and the prince's current mistress, because British high society in the 1930s played by rules that would make your head spin. Nothing dramatic happened right away. The prince collected relationships with married women the way some people collect stamps, and at first Wallis was just another American socialite in his orbit. But somewhere around 1934, something shifted, and the casual acquaintance turned into an obsession. Edward fell for Wallis in a way that people who knew him said they'd never seen before, with an intensity that seemed to blind him to everything else, including the fact that she was still married to Ernest Simpson. Their relationship intensified over the next 2 years, while the British press maintained a bizarre silence about the whole affair, even as American and European newspapers ran wild with the story. Summer of 1936 brought them to the Mediterranean together on a vacation that created an international scandal, with photographs showing them lounging on yachts while Ernest Simpson stayed home in London. The cracks in Wallis's second marriage had become a chasm, and Edward showed no signs of caring about the consequences. Then, on January 20th, 1936, King George V died. He wasn't the Prince of Wales anymore. He wasn't the heir waiting in the wings. At 41 years old, he became King Edward VIII, and the stakes of his relationship with Wallis Simpson went from scandalous to catastrophic. That's when everything started falling apart. The impossible problem. Here's the thing about why this became a constitutional crisis instead of just another royal romance. Edward wanted to marry Wallis, but she had 2 ex-husbands who were both still alive, and she divorced both of them. In 1936 Britain, that wasn't merely scandalous or embarrassing or inappropriate, it was legally and constitutionally impossible for a sitting British monarch. The Church of England created the first brick wall. Edward held the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, which meant he was technically the head of the entire Anglican Church, and that church had rock-solid doctrine opposing remarriages of divorced people while their former spouses still lived. You couldn't be the leader of a church whose fundamental teachings you were actively violating, or at least that's what everyone from the Archbishop of Canterbury to the average parish priest believed. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin built the second wall, and he made his position crystal clear when he told Edward that the king's wife becomes queen, whether statute law says so or not. Baldwin and his entire cabinet considered Wallis Simpson completely unsuitable to wear the crown, and they weren't shy about saying it. The Dominion governments in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and elsewhere agreed with Baldwin, and their approval was constitutionally required for any royal marriage. Strike 3. British public opinion formed the final barrier. Newspaper readers who finally learned about the relationship in December 1936 mostly disapproved, and the letters flooding into Parliament and Buckingham Palace made that disapproval loud and clear. October 27, 1936, brought Wallis's divorce from Ernest Simpson to its legal conclusion, with the decree Nishi becoming final. November found Edward informing Baldwin that he intended to marry her regardless of the obstacles. The British press broke their strange months-long silence on December 3rd, and suddenly the country found itself in a full-blown constitutional crisis with no obvious way out. Edward and his advisors scrambled for solutions. They proposed what's called a morganatic marriage, a European tradition where Wallis would be legally Edward's wife, but wouldn't hold the title of queen, and any children they had wouldn't have succession rights to the throne. Parliament would have needed to pass special legislation to make it work, and the idea went over like a lead balloon. Baldwin rejected it. The Dominion governments rejected it. The cabinet rejected it. Edward was trapped in a corner with only 2 doors, and he could only walk through one. He could stay King of England and give up Wallis, or he could marry the woman he loved and give up the throne. The British Constitution and the Church of England and the entire governmental structure of the United Kingdom wouldn't let him do both. December 10th, 1936 arrived, and Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication after wearing the crown for just 326 days, making his one of the shortest reigns in the entire history of the British monarchy. No coronation had ever taken place, no crown had ever touched his head, and now there never would be one. Parliament moved with stunning speed the next day. His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act passed through both houses in a single day on December 11th, which tells you how eager everyone was to resolve the crisis one way or another. That same evening, Edward sat before a BBC microphone and delivered a speech that would echo through history. The words he spoke became famous. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." Millions listened across Britain and around the world as a king gave up everything for a twice-divorced American woman. December 12th saw him leaving Britain to Austria, and his brother stepped into the role nobody expected him to fill. George became King George VI, which meant his 10-year-old daughter Elizabeth suddenly stood first in line for the throne. Without Wallis Simpson and the crisis she triggered, the abdication never happens. Without the abdication, Elizabeth II never becomes queen. The woman at the center of the scandal changed the succession of the British monarchy, and most historians now believe she changed it for the better. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor. June 3, 1937, finally brought Edward and Wallis to their wedding at a chateau in France, more than 6 months after he'd given up the throne to marry her. The new King George VI granted his brother the title Duke of Windsor, which made Wallis the Duchess of Windsor. But the royal family deliberately withheld something that mattered more than most people outside aristocratic circles would understand. They denied Wallis the style Her Royal Highness, a calculated snub that communicated exactly what the royal family thought of her. Edward and Wallis felt that insult for the rest of their lives, and it poisoned whatever small chance existed for reconciliation with his family. What happened next made everything worse and added a dark stain to their story that they could never wash out. October 1937, just months after their wedding, brought the Duke and Duchess of Windsor to Nazi Germany on a 12-day tour that horrified people back in Britain. They met Adolf Hitler at his Berchtesgaden retreat, they smiled for photographs with Nazi officials, and they toured factories and social programs while the Nazi propaganda machine made the most of every moment. Historians still argue about how deep their Nazi sympathies actually ran, but nobody disputes that they supported appeasement policies and that the visit was a catastrophic mistake. The photographs exist, the newsreels captured it all, and the damage to their reputation became permanent. World War II started in 1939, and the British government faced an awkward problem: what to do with a former king who'd just spent time shaking hands with Hitler. The solution came in 1940, when the Duke received an appointment as Governor of the Bahamas, a position he held until 1945. Everyone understood it for what it was, a comfortable exile that kept him thousands of miles away from Europe during the war. Peace in 1945 didn't bring Edward and Wallis back to Britain. They settled in France instead, taking up residence in a house in Paris' Bois de Boulogne that the city leased to them at nominal rent. Edward received a regular allowance from the royal family, which supported the lifestyle they maintained as fixtures of international café society. They entertained constantly, traveled extensively, and became minor celebrities known more for their parties than their past. Wallis transformed herself into a style icon, photographed wherever she went and analyzed by fashion magazines who documented every outfit. Whatever scandal had attached to her name, she knew how to dress and how to be seen, and she used those skills to craft a public image that was more glamorous than sympathetic. The marriage lasted 35 years. May 28, 1972 brought Edward's death in Paris at 77, with Wallis at his bedside when the end came. His body went back to Britain for burial at Frogmore, returning to the country he'd left 3.5 decades earlier. Whatever else you want to say about Wallis Simpson and the choices she made, the relationship was real. She stayed with him until he died, she mourned him, and she spent the rest of her life as his widow. Wallis's final years. The years after Edward's death brought Wallis nothing but decline. She lived in increasing isolation in Paris, watched over by a French lawyer named Maître Suzanne Blum, who took control of her affairs and kept most people away from her. Dementia crept in the mid-1970s and stole her memories, her personality, everything that had made her Wallis Simpson. Public sightings became rare and then stopped altogether. The woman who loved being photographed and seen vanished into seclusion, and the stories that leaked out from inside her Paris home painted a picture of tragedy. She didn't remember who she was anymore, didn't remember Edward, didn't remember the abdication or the crown he'd given up or the 50 years they'd spent together in exile. April 24, 1986, brought pneumonia and death when Wallis was 89 years old. Her final years had been marked by confusion and isolation, a sad end for a woman who'd once shaken the most powerful institution in Britain. 5 days later, on April 29th, they buried her next to Edward at Frogmore Royal Burial Ground in Windsor, returning her to the country that had never really accepted her. Queen Elizabeth II attended the funeral along with other members of the royal family, a gesture of reconciliation that came almost 50 years too late to matter, but that showed how time had softened some of the old wounds. Sotheby's auctioned the Windsor estate after her death, and the sale raised millions for charity while dispersing jewelry, furniture, and personal effects to collectors around the world, the last physical remnants of the woman who caused a constitutional crisis scattered to the winds, bought by people who wanted a piece of the story. The real Wallis Simpson. So who was she really, and what should we believe about the woman at the center of all this drama? Was Wallis Simpson the calculating social climber who stole a king from his country? Or was she a scapegoat who got blamed for a man's own terrible choices? The truth sits somewhere in the complicated middle ground between those two extremes. Her own memoirs tell a story that contradicts the popular narrative. According to what she wrote and what several people close to her confirmed, Wallis was actually horrified when Edward chose abdication over keeping the throne. She claimed she tried to talk him out of it, tried to make him see reason, tried to convince him that giving up the throne was a catastrophic mistake. Her own words from those memoirs were clear. "I never made any secret of my displeasure with his decision to give up the throne." Edward's mother, Queen Mary, saw things differently, and she didn't hold back when she wrote to her son about what he'd done. Her letter cut deep. "You did not seem to take in any point of view but your own. I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation." She blamed Edward for the crisis, not Wallis, and she made it clear that his obsession destroyed any chance he had at being an effective king. Modern historians increasingly argue that Edward would have been a disaster as king, regardless of whether Wallis Simpson had ever entered his life. His relationships with government officials ranged from poor to openly hostile. He showed almost no interest in the actual duties and responsibilities of being a king, and he seemed to think the crown was something he deserved rather than something he needed to earn through service. Biographer Philip Ziegler put it bluntly when he wrote that Edward was ill-equipped to reign. The abdication might actually have saved Britain from a king who would have led them badly, especially when war came just 3 years later. George VI turned out to be exactly the kind of steady, dutiful monarch that Britain needed during World War II, and nobody thinks Edward would have filled that role half as well. But here's the thing. Wallis paid the price for it all. The royal family denied her the status she had expected, the British public blamed her for the crisis, and she never found acceptance from the institution that had rejected her. 50 years of exile followed, 50 years of being too American for Britain and too royal for America, 50 years of living in France because she didn't truly belong anywhere else. She didn't ask Edward to abdicate, she didn't force his hand or manipulate him into giving up the throne, but she became the villain in the story anyway, the woman who ruined everything, and that reputation followed her to the grave. Why it still matters. Nearly 80 years have passed since the abdication crisis, but the story refuses to fade away because it touches something fundamental about duty, choice, and the price people pay when they challenge power. The crisis fundamentally rewrote the future of the British monarchy. George VI took the throne as a man who'd never expected to be king, who'd never been prepared for it, who struggled with a severe stammer that made public speaking torture. But he led Britain through World War II with quiet dignity, and his daughter, Elizabeth, went on to become the longest reigning monarch in British history. The abdication put better people on the throne, and Britain benefited from Edward's choice even if he didn't. But the rules changed over time. Divorced people can marry into